I want to take a little bit of time and talk about why we have a Bible in the first place. In order to really understand the literature of the New Testament, of the Hebrew Bible, of the Quran, of any sort of scripture, it's really important to understand where that text came from and why we have it in the first place. So, a few preliminary notes. The origin of both religions, so Judaism and Christianity, at the very kind of earliest stages of those traditions, they didn't have books. Today, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, among other religions, all are book-based religions. And yet, at the very foundation of these two main traditions that we're going to be talking about, they didn't have books by which they would derive their knowledge. And so, as the traditions developed, there was necessarily a need to write some literature down, and we'll talk about that. So today, all three of the Abrahamic faiths are book religions. And what I mean here is the literature acts as an epistemological foundation. In many respects, the collection of literature acts as a means of knowledge by which the Jews, Christians, and Muslims understand who God is, understand what it means to be human, understand what our role is in the earth. And so today we are book people, and yet it hasn't always been like that. So the ancient Jews, the way in which they would worship was by making sacrifices to God. I'm going to kind of walk through a brief Jewish history outline here in a few minutes, but I need to get this in your mind at the forefront of this, that Jews worship by making sacrifice. So I'm talking like 13th century BCE, 12th century, 11th century, basically the 1200s, the 1300s, all the way through until you're going to see a little bit later about 586. So I want to unpack two things over here really quickly. So number one, much of what we have in the Bible today, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, it existed as oral tradition. Now, once we see the written word taking shape, in other words, once people actually started writing stuff down, using the written word over oral tradition, things were written down. Now, I want to talk briefly about a preconceived notion that a lot of people have here is that oral tradition is not reliable. But in the ancient world, before the written word came about, oral tradition was very reliable. That was their only means of preserving knowledge and truth. And so at nighttime, when people would sit down, oftentimes in a communal setting, around a fire maybe, they would tell these stories. And the elders of that community would ensure that the story is correct when they are passing it down to the next generation, because that is how they're able to really know who they are. And so once we start to see the written word taking shape, once we start to see people actually writing stuff down, these oral traditions were many times written. So number three, the literature was collected and edited over several hundred years. So during number three, so during this collecting and editing period, some of these texts, some of these stories were used so much that they came to be authoritative. The texts were used for specific reasons, and if you use it over and over and over again, it starts to have some very real significance to you. And so when the literature was used over and over and over and over and over and over again, it became very significant. It became an epistemological foundation. It became a means of knowledge, and it became scripture. So just a couple of parameters here. A lot of what we have in the Hebrew Bible was written between the 8th century and the 5th century BCE, so 700s through the 400s. And so you need to be thinking now, well, what happened during the 8th and 7th and 6th century that would have caused the Jews to write stuff down? It's not just the emergence of writing as a form. Something else must have happened here. What we have in the Hebrew Bible was collected and edited over several hundred years. And then the process to close the Hebrew Bible began around the year 90 of the Common Era in response to the rise of Christianity. Christianity started writing their own literature, and Christianity started to diverge a little bit from its Jewish roots. And so Jews started to write their texts down. So here's where you really need to grasp this. The Jews' collected writings is a need to create a new form of worship. So remember, please, that the Jews would worship by making sacrifice. So let me walk through a few key dates here. So we don't know when the Jews started to gather together north of Egypt. So there are several different theories and there are several different arguments. But remember, in the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Exodus, it tells a story of a Jewish exodus, of Jews leaving Egypt. They were slaves and they started to migrate north. Between the years 1050 and 930 is what a lot of historians call the United Kingdom. And what we mean by this is, if you can look at this darker outline here, is that from 1050 to 930, the Jews, they all were together in this one nation. They were not split, the south and the north, like the green and the pink and the red, whatever that color is. They were all united together. But around the year 930, so this is, if you can think back of your Hebrew Bible, King Saul, King David, and King Solomon. What King Solomon did, though, is he was the one who dedicated the Jewish temple. Remember, Saul had the vision for it, David built it, and King Solomon dedicated it. But upon the dedication of the temple, there were two chief priests. There were two religious leaders that were kind of vying for that position. And one was nominated, elected to be the priest, and the other one was not. And so around the year 930, we start to see two nations emerge. The nation in the south called Judah, and the nation in the north called Israel. Now, what's really important here is to remember that the temple was located down in Jerusalem. And this is again where the Jews would make their sacrifice. They would go down to Jerusalem, they would make a yearly sacrifice, and then they would go back to their home countries, or their hometowns. But in the year 722 BCE, so the Assyrians up here, they started to march south. They wanted to get down to Egypt to take land, to be able to be a part of like a more exhaustive port here, and to also be closer to the avenues by which trade would occur down here in Jerusalem. And so they started marching south. And in 722, the Assyrians, they overthrew and they destroyed, in a sense, the northern kingdom. Now, is this catastrophic for the Jewish people? Well, if you lived in the north, yes. But it wasn't really catastrophic for the Jewish nation as a whole, because remember, the Jews had the temple down in Jerusalem. The Assyrians only made it down here to the border. They didn't make it all the way through Judah. The army kind of held them back. And so the Jews were, in a sense, okay. So this first is known as the Assyrian exile, or the fall of the northern kingdom. Let me pause for a second. Why is worship so important? In many ways, worship reinforces the identity of a people. So I want to give a non-religious example here. Why is the celebration of July 4th in America such an important event? Well, what that event does is that reinforces the identity of a people. Why is it that Americans, like before most sporting events, they sing the national anthem? Again, it reinforces the identity of a people. And two, why in Episcopal schools, why in Catholic schools do people have regular chapel services? Well, that reinforces the identity of a people. The Assyrian Empire was invaded and overtaken by the Babylonians, and so the Babylonians had quite a bit of land, and they too wanted to get down here to Egypt. And so in 586, they started pushing south. And this is really going to be problematic for the Jews because the Babylonians, they start pushing south. They overthrow the walls of Jerusalem. They invade and destroy the temple. And now the Jews are left with this major conundrum. And the question that I need you to write down and to think about is, how are the Jews going to worship now that their temple is destroyed? How is it that they are going to reinforce their identity now that the temple is destroyed? So this is known as the Babylonian exile. The Babylonians, they had all of this land. The best and the brightest were taken up here to Nineveh, the capital of Babylon. And it was really a difficult time for the Jews because they didn't know how to worship. They didn't know how to reinforce their own identity, and they were spread over a wide variety of land. This is known as one of the diasporas, the Jewish dispersion out from their homeland. In 539, the Persians, they took over the Babylonians, and they were a little bit more accepting. They let the Jews go back to their land, and they rebuilt and they dedicated their temple. But when the temple was destroyed, the Jews had to create a new form of worship. They didn't have a place to go worship, and they had some texts being written down, and they had some stories, and they had some of their prophetic literature. And so the main reason that we have a Hebrew Bible today is in 586 and in the probably few decades after, Jewish identity was in a milieu. They had to really wrestle with and grapple with the idea of how are we going to worship? How are we going to continue to reinforce our own identity? And so the main reason that we have a Hebrew Bible today is that the Jews needed to create a new form of worship. And so I want you to think of the Bible and of the Hebrew Bible not as a book, but as a collection of books, as literature. You know, there is myth, there is folklore, there is law, there is history. And the reason I say this in history, in quotations, is the purpose of that literature is not simply to say, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. There's poetry, there's wisdom literature, and there's prophetic literature speaking against the nation, speaking against the kings and the way in which they were neglecting the needs of the poor, and really the call of God to help the poor and the oppressed. And there's also apocalyptic literature. So all of these types of literatures, all of these texts were used during worship to inform the practices and beliefs of this Jewish tradition. And so why did the Bible develop the way that it did? Well, the Jews needed a form of worship that was formative and substantive towards the Jewish nation and its people. But I want to go back to one thing. In the year 70 of the Common Era, the Jewish temple down here again was destroyed by the Romans. And so for basically, several hundred years, 400 years or so, the Jews had, they had literature to worship with. They didn't worship the Bible. They used the Bible to worship. They used that text to worship. And they also had a temple to worship in. But in the year 70 of the Common Era, one of these two things is going to go away. The books or the temple, and it's the temple. And so when the temple is destroyed a second time, it's not as catastrophic for the Jewish people as it was in the year 586, because now they have a new form of worship. And so to reiterate my main point one more time, we have a Hebrew Bible. The Jewish people developed their literature, their texts, as a means of worshiping God, of reinforcing their identity, of having formative and substantive text that would inform and shape the identity of the Jewish nation and its people in worship of God. So the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, didn't just come out of nowhere. God didn't just write it. It developed over about 1100 years or so. But it was used as a form of worship. Jews historically used it as a form of worship. Jesus used the Hebrew Bible as a means of worshiping God. Ancient Jews after the time of Jesus used the text, and today Jews still use that text as a means and a way of worshiping God.